Hi, my name is Izzy, as I'm more commonly known as on TikTok, Dunbertree, where, to put it nicely, I kind of just make videos about politics in my car. It's not very glamorous, but I guess this is kind of like an elongated version of that, because I'm going to be speaking about similar topics and similar concepts that I already do speak on that app. So I'm going to be covering things like white privilege, performative activism, and it's kind of like a workshop as to how you can kind of better yourself as an ally to this movement, or at least I'm just going to speak on how I try to best be an ally to this movement. So if you weren't aware already, the Black Lives Matter movement is an ongoing political struggle that started in the US, and I say ongoing because it's been ongoing for the past 7 years. But arguably you could say it catalysed this year, May 25th, with the unjustifiable death of George Floyd. George Floyd, who was unjustifiably killed by the Minneapolis Police Department for cashing a fake check. Now the reason why what happened to George Floyd resonated with all of us is because it was documented. And it was documented for 9 minutes. We were there with him for 9 minutes as he said he couldn't breathe, as no one relented, no one let up, no one helped him. It struck a chord with the globe, and arguably a lot of young people as well. But to understand why what happened to George Floyd happened to him, and also why it would never happen to someone who looks like me, we have to unpack a concept known as white privilege. One of the things that people kind of misconstrue about white privilege is the fact that it doesn't make you inherently racist to possess it, nor does it make you a racist person for having it or benefiting from it. Because white privilege isn't something you can kind of capitalise off of or kind of stock away and spend when you want. It's not something that you can possess in that way. More so, I would argue that it's the abundance of certain suffrages, it's the abundance of certain inconveniences within society. To be more specific, having white privilege and recognising it is not racist, but white privilege exists because of historic, enduring racism and biases. It's the inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in society characterised by racial inequality and injustice. So to conclude, it's kind of like the fact that racism does happen and the fact that racism does exist. Having white privilege is not enduring that racism in the same way that other people might. So you might be asking yourself a question, like, what does white privilege have to do with the criminal justice system? How does it present itself? What is the correlation between white privilege and George Floyd? Well, the thing you need to understand about white privilege in the criminal justice system is the fact that it is a systemic issue and it presents itself in all aspects of society. In America, more specifically, the actual police system that we see nowadays evolved from slave patrols. So arguably you could say from the get-go it was built off of racism and built off of a racist notion. Now, to be more specific, within the UK, David Lammy, an MP, actually did a review and a report, and he found something quite astonishing. Say me and a black friend both committed the same drug offence and we were both held and detained. Well, they are 240% more likely to face prison time than me, their white counterpart, due to racial bias and due to racial stigmas attached to black people and attached to white people within our society. In fact, this has a net effect. It means that just 14% of the UK population is made up of black and ethnic minority groups, and yet somehow make up 25% of the UK prison population. How does that make sense? Well, white privilege. That being said, no one's saying you can't have a hard life if you're a white person, nor are they saying that your life won't be difficult. In fact, you can obviously face a whole host of different discriminations due to class, gender, sexuality. White privilege is more the abundance of yet another type of discrimination within our society, which is obviously racial discrimination. And this is where we get into different types of privileges. I have a whole host of privilege as a white woman, yet I still face a lot of sexism within our society as a woman. So therefore my privilege as a white woman is nothing compared to the privilege that a white male may have in comparison. And on the contrary, the privilege that I face as a white woman is nothing compared to the misogyny and the misogynoir that a black woman may face. So misogyny is basically the hatred of women in general society. You can be a misogynist if you just hate women, whilst misogynoir is the specific, kind of crossroads of race and gender, of hatred of black women. Arguably, misogynoir is just gross because it's basically where black women face like a whole different type of discrimination as opposed to black men. But this is how I'm going to bridge point on to my next thing, which is intersectionality. Now, to be more specific, intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create unique modes of discrimination and privilege. So as a white woman, I have a whole host of different privileges, but that is nothing in comparison to a white man who may not face sexism in the same way that a woman will. And once again, the privilege that I have is incomparable to the discrimination that a black woman may face, because they have what's known as the double burden of gender and race. It's like a crossroads. where they face discrimination not only for being a woman but for also being a black woman. Now this can also meet head when you come to sexuality as well. If you are, say, a black gay woman, there's a whole different host of intersectionality because you're facing whole different hosts of discrimination. This is why when people say cisgendered white woman, you have the benefit of being your gender that you assigned at birth, being white, and being a woman. These are whole different hosts of privileges that you may not realise. That being said, intersectionality identifies advantages and disadvantages that are felt by people due to the combination of factors. So if you are, for example, an intersectional feminist, you can kind of recognise that the experience that I am having will be entirely different to the experience of a person of colour, because you recognise the inherent privileges that you have as a white woman, or in comparison, the disadvantages you may receive as a black woman. Now this kind of, the natural enemy, I would say, of intersectionality is white feminism. Now to be specific, white feminism ignores the experiences of women of colour. White feminism is used to describe feminist theories that focus on the struggles of white women without addressing the distinct forms of oppression faced by ethnic minority women. So a white feminist may just focus on the experiences that she has as a white woman, or he has as a white male, as opposed to recognising the fact that they also have privilege despite this intersectionality, and they need to actively fight against this. Okay, so now we get on to one of my favourite theoretical concepts, which is basically the notion of white fragility. And white fragility was coined by Professor Robin DiAngelo. And basically she kind of travels around and speaks about diversity, but she speaks about it from the white perspective. Kind of like what I'm doing today, but on a much more glamorous level, I'm sure. And basically I'm going to read an extract from her book, White Fragility, to kind of explain what it is and how it comes into fruition within our real lives. So, white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. The moves include fear, guilt, anger, defensiveness, argumentation, even silence and leaving the room to avoid said racial stress. Racial stress results from an interruption as to what is racially familiar, so your racial experience and your racial perspective as a white person, it's a trigger against that. These interruptions can take a variety of forms and come from a range of sources, including suggesting that a white person's viewpoint comes from a racialized frame of reference, people of colour talking directly about their racial perspectives, aka a challenge to write racial codes, people of colour choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people in regards to race. Basically, there's been this notion within the Black Lives Matter campaign currently going on that white lives and white feelings are kind of being put over black lives, so black people can't speak about their experiences wholeheartedly due to things like tone policing, because of the notion that they kind of have to protect how white people may digest this. You know, you have to filter how you speak, regardless as to whether it will put your life in danger or not, to protect white feelings and white lives. One of the ways that white feminism can be a hindrance to the feminist movement is through things like tone policing. Now, tone policing is basically a version of ad hominem where people kind of attack the content of your character rather than what you're actually saying, due to the stereotype that women are more emotional. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Men and women both can be emotional, especially when it comes to things like politics. I feel like politics is the one thing where emotion should be allowed into it, because political issues matter, political things matter. When I'm speaking on something that I care deeply about, of course I'm going to be emotional about it. But for some reason this doesn't seem to fly within the debate world, and ad hominem is a way to kind of detract from people who attack the content of your character rather than the content as to what you're actually saying. So to be more specific, tone policing detracts from the validity of a statement by attacking the tone in which it's presented rather than the content as to what you're saying or the message itself. So people, rather than acknowledge the point, would actually say, well, you're being a bit emotional, why don't you just calm down a bit? Tone policing puts women in a no-win situation where basically you can't win either way, because the content as to what you're saying is being attacked as well as your character and the way that you're presenting information. Now this rears its head again within white feminism and the tone policing of black women, because white feminism kind of presents this notion where if you speak to people with respect, they'll respect you. And arguably within a society that kind of depends on white affluence and has things like white privilege, this is not the case. Especially when black women's pleas are falling on deaf ears. I mean, they've been saying the same thing for the past however many decades and still nothing has changed. Tone policing in a way kind of limits black women once again, because if they ask nicely, no one listens, and if they demand it, there's suddenly this angry black woman trope. I mean, they literally are put in a no-win situation by both wider outer society and also the nuanced topics within the feminist movement. Civil rights champion Martin Luther King Jr. himself even said in his letter from Birmingham jail, he condemned this type of silencing, writing that he was gravely disappointed with the white moderate who was more devoted to order rather than justice. This kind of notion that you care more about the manner in which people present their injustices rather than the injustice themselves. However, the issue with posting about political things on TikTok is the fact that it can present itself as a means of performative activism. So to be specific, performative activism is a prerogative term referring to activism done to increase one's social capital rather than one's devotion to the cause. I could be posting about Black Lives Matter without, say, for example, providing any links to any petitions, for example. And this is seen as performative activism because, well, why are you posting about it? What do you gain from posting about it? And this can also be seen with things like Blackout Tuesday. Now, Blackout Tuesday had all of the makings of being a great social media political thing, but it was kind of overtaken by this notion of performative activism because people could post the black square and appear anti-racist. But I think it was found that, statistically speaking, more millions of people posted hashtag Blackout Tuesday than had signed the George Floyd petition. So arguably this is performative activism because it was only surface level. It was to increase one's social capital because all of their friends and family followed them. They could see the Blackout Tuesday square and think, wow, they're actively anti-racist. But millions of people hadn't even signed the petition. They weren't aware of the cause. I guess as a way to kind of conclude or wrap this up, I just want to add that I know it may come across like a very negative video, and I know it may come across like I'm kind of telling everyone off for all of these things that arguably aren't even your fault. But the thing with aspects of white privilege and performative activism is that as long as you're aware of it and you're actively being anti those things, you're being a good ally. The main point of pointing out things like white privilege is so that you're aware of it and so you can implicitly use that to black people's advantage within this political struggle. You can use your white privilege to, say, stand in front of black protesters at rallies. You can use it to, defend your co-worker who's facing racism. You can use it even in school to defend people who are facing racism, because people will listen to you, other white people will listen to you due to things like white fragility. But as I've said already, it is not enough to just be non-racist. It's not enough to just say, well, I'm not racist, or argue these things. You have to be anti-racist. You have to actively be proactively engaging in these conversations with yourself. What am I doing today that's anti-racist? How am I helping people around me? How am I amplifying black voices? How am I buying from black companies, black-owned companies, for example? You have to proactively take steps in order to be engaged in this conversation. It's not enough to just post on Instagram anymore, and I argue it was never enough. But I hope you found this interesting. I mean, I really enjoyed doing it. Thank you very much. And yeah. Follow me on TikTok if you want.